Defense Forces yesterday released the initial report about what happened in Be'eri, the kibbutz where about 10% of people slaughtered on October 7th, 10% of the victims were there. This is, of course, the first of many reports to be expected on what exactly happened on October 7th, what led to October 7th, and this report has been making headlines in Israel for various reasons. You know, the content of it, what's not in it, who is, of course, the blame game is obviously going to be a part of it. Um, Part of the issue was, of course, as we know, the fact that the IDF didn't even enter the kibbutz until sometime in the afternoon. The fighters who were there, you know, were greatly outnumbered. The kibbutz members were fighting on their own for a while. James, I'm joined by James Valliant. James, what are your initial thoughts here on this report and what happened there on October 7th?
Well, of course, the first thing I'd want to say to make sure that we get the context here properly is that nothing in this report diminishes, in my mind, the responsibility of the Hamas monsters or the so-called Palestinian civilians who joined in with the attack. No one, I mean, look, they're the ones who did the aggressive act. It was a surprise attack, and it was filled with atrocities, filled with the most horrific atrocities, as we've covered. Nothing that we say here should excuse or diminish the moral outrage that we have that Hamas were the perpetrators of this. Um, and, you know, the truth is that if I let down my defenses and someone still aggressively attacks me in a horrible way, that doesn't diminish the fact that they're the aggressors. They were the initiators of force. On the other hand, that does raise a moral question for me, doesn't it? If I had plenty of notice that this person might attack me in some way, I do have a moral responsibility. If I'm a government, I have that moral responsibility to my people. And so it does appear to me, and it has appeared to us to be somewhat obvious since October 7th, that the Israeli Defense Forces were not adequately prepared for what happened. You would have thought that there would have been a better and more immediate response. The delay, as you point out, in some of these cases appears to be very real. Where the simple kibbutz members, simple villagers, civilians had to really defend themselves for hours. They would say, "Well, there's a briefing going on over here." What? Okay, I understand the need to coordinate, but why didn't you have forces there, more forces on the ground that could have responded quickly? So I think this deserves this kind of attention and analysis. I think that there was some negligence on the part of Israel, and that should all be brought to light. I do not think that this is some kind of false flag operation by Netanyahu or something, or some sinister conspiracy on his part, although there are all kinds of people, I'm sure, who will draw those kind of conclusions. That I am nowhere near the point where I believe that's even a credible hypothesis. No one could have anticipated the horrors of October 7th to the degree that they happened. On the other hand, the Israeli government should have anticipated some kind of attack, just as they anticipate attacks from Lebanon, from the north, Hezbollah. So they should be acutely aware of the potential of attacks from the Gaza Strip. Um, so yeah, it is a moral issue. Government's responsibility is the physical protection of its own people. And in this regard, October 7th was not a good day for Israel. I think we can all know that, see that on the face of it, and it does appear that the Israeli army should probably have been better prepared, at least to respond to something down in the south.
Yeah, we'll get into a few of the details of that were in the report. As you, I think, said, although you may have said this in the production meeting right before we went on the air, you're not a military strategist, neither am I. But we do have clear views on morality, clear views on the role of government and what government should be doing in such situations. And yeah, leaving aside even the false flag claims, there's, when you hear pro-Palestinians asking, or let's say hypothesizing that maybe Israel let some of it happen while it was happening, the irony there is, first of all, again, yeah, there's if you're supporting the Palestinians, you're essentially saying, you know what, like we can say you should lock your front door, right? But the fact that you haven't locked your front door does not mean that a murderer coming into your home and murdering you is fine and it's your fault.
Right.
And
That's
in
an
this
important
sense,
moral distinction.
it is the same people who claim that Gaza is an open air prison and that there's something wrong with Israel not allowing Palestinians in, who then ask the questions why Israel didn't do more to prevent it, even on the day. Now, Israel didn't do enough to prevent it even on the day, in part because when people were flooding through wherever the fence was breached, if they appeared unarmed, Israel, even if it had the possibility, the opportunity to do something, they didn't do. They didn't kill unarmed civilians because they're unarmed and they're civilians. They're not in military uniform. There's no reason to believe that they're terrorists unless you understand and acknowledge what the Palestinian people are. And I think that's what, more broadly, what the problem for Israel was in the run-up to October 7th and on October 7th. Yeah, there was not enough preparation for the possibility of this because Israel deludes itself to believe that the Palestinian people actually want peace. Unfortunately for them, there's Hamas preventing or standing in the way. But what they really want is peace, and we saw that the exact opposite is true, especially since after Hamas, the Nukba fighters who were preparing for this had gone in. The Palestinian people, many of whom heard about this, just went in as well and did whatever they can do. And of course, others were celebrating in the streets.
I would note that IDF watch towers and outposts were part of the attack. Part of the attack. So yes, the IDF itself came under attack. Those outposts themselves, not to mention the kibbutzim, should have been better protected, though. But it's a question of how much should you have protected them, and that's a judgment call. Now, you're absolutely right. That judgment is clouded by the same distorting fantasy that Western diplomats and governments have, that Hamas somehow desires, or the Palestinians in general somehow really do desire peace with Israel. They do not. In fact, and I can understand perhaps being taken aback by the extent of the atrocities. Perhaps that couldn't be anticipated, but in a way, even that could be. Even that, if you listen to them, if you look at their history, if you look at the madness of their society and their culture and their values, even something like that should have been sort of anticipated. But you make a really great point. The entire West, as well as the Israeli government, are somehow deluded into thinking that these people still think like human beings. That is the welfare of their own. We've pointed out how many times it's not the welfare of their children that they're concerned about. It's not the safety of their wives they're concerned about. They're perfectly willing to kill their own civilians in a tactical manner in their effort to destroy Israel. That's why they put stuff in hospitals and schools. That's why they don't wear uniforms. And so the point is, Israel's got to take that not wearing uniform business seriously. When you see Palestinians breaking down a fence or crossing over and coming over in gangs, you should, the fact that they're not in uniform or the fact that you can't see weapons is not necessarily an indication that they're not a threat, is it? Quite the opposite. And so it's things like that. They don't wear uniforms. Look at how they're, I mean, we even had the admissions from the Hamas leadership. They want civilian deaths. It's their tactics. And so when you're dealing with people who want their own babies dead, they're not like you and me, Mr. Biden, Mr. Blinken. No, they're not. They're not Mr. Netanyahu. And we have to wake up and realize that these people are, in that sense, not human in the way they think about things. They want their own children dead. As horrifying as it is, and it's hard for a good person to wrap their head around that kind of thinking, that kind of possibility. They are perfectly willing to have many, 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 many of their own civilians, children, their wives, killed in the course, people in hospitals. children in schools killed. It's like they shoot and kill, and then they hold their own baby up in front of their face to protect themselves. This is the kind of, I mean, I know this is an analogy, but this is what we're talking about, the mentality. They do not share the same human benevolent values that most people in the West do. They simply do not. And we have to wrap our minds around that.
Yeah, there's an irony about, pro-Palestinian people in the West talking about what's going on in Gaza and talking about women and children specifically. First of all, as if somehow the IDF has super smart bombs that only kill the women and children, or somehow they're the only ones in harm's way. But also, it is once again, I keep making this point that pro-Palestinians in the West seem to have never listened to any Palestinian, never talked to any Palestinian. Because while we hear in the West about women and children, Palestinian women are celebrating when their Palestinian children are killed, if they're killed as part of an attempt to murder Jews, especially if that attempt is successful. Let's go through so this is a general timeline of what happened. So the attack on Be'eri started at 6:45 a.m. Israel time. Between then and 9 a.m., 340 terrorists got into the kibbutz from two directions, and the kibbutz residents were fighting on their own against these terrorists. Again, 340 armed terrorists. I don't know how many people actually live in the kibbutz, but kibbutz is typically a few hundred people, not much more. Between 9 a.m. and 1:30, there was an initial IDF force that went in. They were hit. They retreated to the entrance of the kibbutz, and during that time, the 29 hostages who were taken from Be'eri into Gaza, that is when they were taken. So during these hours, the kibbutz was under complete occupation by the Palestinians. And then between 1:30 and 10 p.m., there were significant forces that went in. They basically fought off the terrorists. Eventually, it took until 5 a.m. the next morning, or possibly even later, before the kibbutz had been fully control had been fully taken again by the IDF. So this was really a nightmare scenario for Israel, and again a nightmare that they chose to believe could not happen until then, and yeah, and so 100 people from Be'eri were killed, 29 taken hostage, 11 are still hostage, or are still held by the Palestinians.
Right. And there was another incident that they were discussing, at least in the reports about how hostages were themselves killed potentially by IDF in an attack on Palestinians. That's a fog of war kind of issue in my mind. It's really hard, and I would want to see the evidence, and maybe there is evidence that can help us understand if that, how responsible or negligent that was. But all other things being equal, sight unseen, without the evidence, it's really hard for me to blame defenders when hostages are being taken if they happen to also kill hostages who are already in the custody of Palestinian monsters like that. On the other hand, I'm open to hearing the evidence as to whether or not that was negligent or not. But if you're in that moment now, what you said there, the most distressed me is the time, the hours upon hours upon hours that these poor villagers had absolutely no help whatever, no help whatever. I just want to cry because we should expect better from our military. We should expect better from our security or police forces in terms of protecting innocent civilians like that. For hours, they were on their own facing these Palestinian monsters. And that disturbs me to the core, I have to admit.
So from what the report states, yeah, there were terrorists were holding kibbutz members hostage in a house there as during the fighting, and that was where tanks fired on that house. From what this report says, they have concluded that Israelis were not killed by that attack, that they were executed um, by Hamas. But yeah, of course, I mean, in such a situation, you need to kill the enemy combatants, and in this case, terrorists who want to take human shields like they do with their own people. They would obviously want to do that with Israelis. Yeah, this is another thing that the pro-Palestinians have been using since October 7th to say, look, it was actually Israeli, the IDF that killed Israelis.
That's
Well,
what they say. They'll
yeah,
make the allegation that no, we weren't already killing hostages. It was they were killed by IDF.
yeah,
Uh, and
which again, if true, is still very clearly the moral responsibility of the terrorists who started this and who held hostages there. And it also tells you a lot about anybody who would say who would use this to, like Al Jazeera did in their documentary, to say, look,
right,
actually, this is Israel at fault here for those deaths where Israelis were held by Hamas.
unbelievable. You take hostages. Someone is trying to defend themselves from your taking hostages and killing people, and you blame the defenders for the death of the hostages you just took. You monsters. Now, the Al Jazeera logic is obviously sick, twisted, and upside down. Anything Israel would do to defend itself, therefore, if it could cause any kind of what we call collateral damage, must be evil. No, it's exactly the opposite. It was nothing but civilians they were aiming for on October 7th, our Hamas monsters. They were aiming for civilians. They were aiming for people at a peace concert, innocent people taken from their beds and homes in the morning, in small villages, as you point out. No, they were the horrific aggressors here, and we can't ever lose our sight, on that ball, ever. No matter what the findings of these investigations are. I think the investigations should go forward, though. I want more detail on all of that. But I have enough detail, thank you very much, to know who the real monsters and enemies are here.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, this is one of several investigations. We're going to have several reports come out.
Yeah.
I'm assuming in the next few months, there's going to have to be a more serious investigation, which I think is probably being delayed in part because people want to hold on to their jobs, and it might be more difficult once these details come out. Um,
Well, see,
but
that's
yeah,
it. They needed their field commanders, and it takes a while to get these investigations because when you're in the middle of a war, and right now, in at least a two-front war, you need your field commanders, you need your officers, and those are the people who'd be able to give you the best evidence on what they knew and what the decision-making processes were. So,
yeah, and unfortunately, what these reports will tell us is going to be, the exact details of what happened, which are important to know to some extent, but it's not going to cause where it's going to cause any changes in actual policy. It might be to, increasing security in the kibbutz or something like that. It's going to be defensive measures that don't tackle the actual problem. The actual problem being the Palestinians having a culture that has only one kind of centerpiece for it, which is the murder of Jews. So you don't prevent that by being defensive. You can prevent some of it. Some of the rockets don't go through because of the Iron Dome, and if you have soldiers stationed everywhere, basically Israel will have to have its entire population armed and deployed 24/7 to fight a war in this manner, which is unfortunately how it appears to this is what it appears to be this is what seems like the takeaway from this, which is we
amazing.
weren't defensive enough.
Yeah, Iran can shoot all of those missiles and rockets at Israel. And then we say, oh, well, see, the defensive forces of the West held them all back. Israel's got this wonderful Iron Dome. Boy, we stopped all of it, and only one Bedouin child was killed. Oh, yoo-hoo. If that's the way you're measuring success, you've lost. If that's the way you're measuring success, you've lost. Yes, okay, improve the security around Gaza, all necessary, and to be sure. But until you take it aggressively to the enemy who's attacked you, and in this sense, I mean aggressively as a defender. Once the force has been initiated, like it has by Hamas, you have every right to go in there and clear out the well, as I've been saying now for many, many months, why northern Gaza wasn't entirely rubble by October 10th, I do not really fully fathom, because that is the kind of right that a defender has. You've got to be aggressive. You've got to be complete. You've got to shatter the psychology of your enemy. And as you point out, the deeper issue is a cultural one. We've got to take, in the West, take a clear moral stand against these people. Stop funding the UN and UNRWA, teaching this horrific propaganda, for example, where we in the West fund through the UN the teaching of kill Jews and be proud to be a martyr in the glorious cause of killing Jews. We are funding through the UN that kind of education. Until we get to the cultural issue, until we have a clear moral stand against it, until we stop subsidizing that awful education, and that in conjunction with a fully full bore defense that doesn't worry about civilian casualties, since Hamas doesn't worry about civilian casualties, there's no real, the fact that your shield works, that's great, but that ain't going to stop it. That ain't going to fix it in the long run. You're just going to continue to have problems. And I fear for the long range survival of Israel, given that approach.
Yeah, and with all these defensive measures, the other side is trying to improve their methods of killing. So they're going to try to improve their rockets, whatever, their tunnels that can go into Israel. So it really makes no sense, especially when you are actually stronger militarily. Makes no sense to go out of your way to not do anything except build defensive measures while allowing the other side to plan to kill you. Thank you, Bonnie, for the super chat. There's a point that I kind of made, but I want to reiterate. And Clementine says in the chat something that kind of will help me lead into this. So she says, the observant soldiers kept warning about it. They said they keep seeing Hamas training, and they were ignored. Yeah, this was a big deal there and this was known pretty much immediately after. And many of those soldiers have been killed or taken hostage. Imagine if they had not been ignored, and imagine if Israel had decided, okay, let's not even go into Gaza preemptively. Let's keep an eye out, and then have planes ready, everything's ready, and then once you see them marching towards the fence, then Israel had bombed them and killed all of them, and there would have been no successful attack on October 7th. Imagine the reaction. I wonder what the U.S. reaction would have been, because Israel would have killed thousands of Palestinians in that military action, and zero Israelis would have died. That you could say, well, look, here are some Israelis that died. We need a military response for this. No, the attack would have been prevented. Palestinians would have died. And what do you think, James, would be the response
Israel
from
would be,
Biden, from Blinken, from Francesca Albanese?
would still have an arrest warrant being proposed in international courts for Netanyahu. We'd still have all that would be. Oh, and you better believe Blinken and Biden would have had all kinds of choice, critical remarks for Israel. Absolutely. Do you think it would have been? No, it would have been. That is the perversity here. The correct moral, correct at least. I mean, in my mind, they could have gone in, as you point out, preemptively. In fact, that's probably what should have happened. The minute you get whiff of that, go in preemptively. But even if it was just as you described, I can only imagine Western leaders. I can only imagine the folks from the Labor Party who are now in government would have had some choice words for Israel, wouldn't they?
Yeah, the conservatives as well. But yeah, Daniel mentions here in our Zoom chat the Great March of Return. This was a few years ago when Palestinians kind of marched towards the fence in kind of a show of defiance to the occupation, or however they put it. And yeah, some Palestinians, I believe, were killed in that, right? And this was also seen as something that Israel is doing to the poor innocent Palestinians who are just again just trying to break out of their open air prison. Now,
so they can kill Jewish babies.
exactly. Exactly. So back then, this was the argument. Now we have those voices in the West much stronger, claiming that that Israel. I want to hear what they would have to say about that, about the fact that in the past they were complaining when Palestinians marched to the fence, and on October 7th we saw what happens when Palestinians march through the fence. And actually, I don't want to hear what they have to say because I know what they have to say. They have to say, everything is all forms of resistance are legitimate, which means rape, murdering babies, taking children hostage and abusing them. All of that is legitimate in their eyes, which is also why, when they talk about genocide and they use that word as a bad thing that Israel is supposedly doing to the Palestinians, these people are supporters of genocide. They're supporters of it's just their genocide isn't going the way they want to and the way it has gone for their predecessors. But they fully support genocide. They fully support the most horrific atrocities that can be committed against people. And this is why they support the Palestinians. Nobody represents that mindset and those values better than the Palestinians.
I couldn't have said it better myself, sir. That is exactly right.
Well, I don't, it is Friday. We should end on a positive, but this is definitely not a topic
Try
where
to
we can.
end on a
Not
positive
only is
note.
this not a topic we can end on a positive note, but yeah, we do we have another show today, which I also don't know how we can end on a positive note.
Yeah.
So coming up in a couple of minutes, the reality show, we will be talking about Candace Owens again, this time defending Hitler. Yeah. So of course, well, let's keep it to that show. James, you will be joining us. We do need a historian for that. By the way, people who haven't, since we have a couple of minutes left, members, YouTube members and members through the website who have not listened to James's first lecture in his new course on the U.S. Constitution from last night, you should do so, especially if you're not Reardon Medal or Midas Mulligan, because that recording is going to be available until next Thursday when the second session happens, and those will only be for those highest levels. But I think even if those memberships are expensive, I understand that not everybody can afford them, but I think the first lecture alone would be of great value to anybody who can't afford those membership levels, but would like to listen to it. If you're not a member at all, this is a good time to become a member and listen to that recording and get access to a lot more, including a lot more of James every week, every Sunday, in our discussions of Leonard Peikoff's courses. So thanks, James. Thanks, everybody, for watching. Join us in a couple of minutes on the reality show where we talk about Candace Owens' excuses for Hitler.
Take care.